What might appear, at first glance, to be merely a mathematics lesson in a sunlit elementary school classroom actually encapsulates the quintessential paradox of education itself, that the most profound learning often occurs in moments of apparent simplicity. Little did Miss Sarah realize, as she stood before her whiteboard contemplating the array of multiplication problems she had written, 2 by 5, 3 by 5, 4 by 5, progressing to more challenging equations like 7 by 6 and 8 by 9, that she was about to witness the crystallization of her decade-long philosophical inquiry into the nature of understanding. The classroom, bathed in the ethereal glow of morning sunlight filtering through large windows, had evolved over the years into what cognitive scientists might term a multimodal learning environment. Yet such clinical terminology failed to capture the organic symbiosis that had developed between the space and its inhabitants. The yellow walls, far from being merely institutional decor, had become what Miss Sarah privately thought of as ambient pedagogy, their warmth subtly nurturing the growth of young minds. Not only had the cursive alphabet strip above the board served its ostensible purpose of handwriting instruction, but it had also become a metaphor for the continuity of learning itself, each letter flowing into the next just as each concept built upon its predecessors. The fraction and percentage cards suspended from the ceiling, progressing methodically from 1/10 equals 10% to 6/10 equals 60%, represented what educational philosophers had long posited, that understanding exists on a continuum, with each increment of knowledge leading inexorably to the next. Tom and Lisa, whose academic partnership had transcended conventional peer tutoring to become what developmental psychologists might term reciprocal cognitive scaffolding, were engaged in helping Emma grasp the underlying patterns of multiplication. Had anyone suggested at the term's beginning that these students would become exemplars of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development theory, Miss Sarah might have been skeptical. "Look at how the numbers dance together," Lisa was explaining, her pink pencil case serving as both practical container and psychological anchor. "When we multiply by 5, it's like they're holding hands and skipping forward." The metaphor, though childlike in its expression, demonstrated a sophisticated grasp of mathematical relationships that would have delighted Piaget himself. The Science Bulletin Board, with its bright blue background and emerald green lettering, had become more than just a display space. It served as what Miss Sarah termed a cognitive intersection, where the Cartesian certainty of mathematics met the empirical inquiry of scientific method. Below it, the yellow caution sign warning of the hot radiator surface provided an unexpectedly perfect example of how theoretical knowledge informed practical safety, a microcosm of the theory-practice dialectic that had preoccupied educational philosophers for centuries. James, whose transformation from mathematical anxiety to confident engagement could have formed the basis for a compelling case study in educational psychology, was now explaining to a classmate, "It's like building with blocks. Each number is a different size block, but they all fit together perfectly." His analogy, though elementarily expressed, touched on fundamental principles of mathematical structure that had occupied the minds of theorists since Pythagoras. The morning light, advancing across the blue desks like the sweep of understanding across developing minds, created what Miss Sarah had come to think of as temporal pedagogy, the way physical environment and natural rhythms contributed to the learning process. The wooden shelf with its rainbow array of plastic bins represented not just storage but what organizational theorists might term accessible cognitive resources, tools for bridging the gap between concrete and abstract thinking. "Miss Sarah," Emma called out, her voice carrying the unmistakable timbre of revelation, "I've noticed something about the patterns. When we multiply even numbers, it's like they're playing leapfrog, but odd numbers make different jumps." The observation, though framed in playground terminology, demonstrated an intuitive grasp of number theory that would have intrigued professional mathematicians. The classroom's ambient sounds, the soft scratch of pencils, the murmur of collaborative problem-solving, the gentle hum of the radiator, created what Miss Sarah had termed in her doctoral research the acoustics of cognition. Each sound contributed to an atmosphere where learning could unfold naturally, where understanding could develop at its own pace. Tom, whose quick mathematical intuition had initially threatened to isolate him from his peers, had developed what educational sociologists might term cognitive empathy, the ability to understand and explain concepts from another's perspective. "Think of multiplication like building a staircase," he was telling Emma. "Each step helps you reach the next one." The metaphor, though simple, touched on fundamental concepts of mathematical progression that had challenged philosophers for millennia. Lisa, studying the fraction cards hanging from the ceiling with newly confident eyes, made an observation that would have delighted advocates of constructivist learning theory. "These cards are like a family tree of numbers, aren't they? Each one related to the others in different ways." Her insight, though expressed in familial terms, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mathematical relationships. The classroom itself had become what anthropologists might term a cultural microcosm, a space where the broader patterns of human learning and development played out in miniature. The careful arrangement of educational materials, from the cursive alphabet to the fraction cards, reflected what architectural theorists called pedagogical space design, the conscious creation of an environment that facilitated learning through its very structure. Miss Sarah observed these interactions with the keen eye of both practitioner and theorist. Her years of teaching had led her to develop what she called educational ecosystem theory, the idea that effective learning environments functioned as complex, interconnected systems where each element contributed to the whole. James, whose earlier struggles with mathematics had nearly convinced him he was mathematically inept, now approached each problem with what cognitive psychologists would term strategic metacognition. "If we look at the pattern," he explained to a classmate, "it's like having a map through number land." His analogy, though playful, reflected sophisticated understanding of mathematical navigation. The morning light continued its journey across the classroom, creating ever-changing patterns that seemed to mirror the dynamic nature of learning itself. Miss Sarah had come to view these light patterns as metaphorical representations of what educational theorists called emergent understanding, the way knowledge developed not linearly but through complex interactions of experience and insight. What particularly fascinated Miss Sarah was the way her students unconsciously demonstrated principles of cognitive development that had occupied researchers for decades. Their conversations, though focused on multiplication tables and number patterns, revealed sophisticated processes of abstract thinking and collaborative learning that would have intrigued cognitive scientists. Emma, whose recent illness had temporarily interrupted her mathematical journey, had returned to discover what neurologists might term cognitive resonance with her peers. "When we work together," she observed, "the numbers make more sense, like they're telling us a story." Her observation touched on fundamental principles of social learning theory that had been articulated by educational researchers. The fraction and percentage cards hanging from the ceiling had evolved from simple visual aids into what semioticians might term mathematical metaphors, physical representations of abstract relationships that helped bridge the gap between concrete and theoretical understanding. Miss Sarah had arranged them deliberately, creating what design theorists would call a visual hierarchy of understanding. As the morning progressed, the classroom continued to function as what Miss Sarah had come to think of as a learning laboratory, a space where theoretical principles of education could be observed in practical application. Each interaction, each moment of understanding, contributed to her growing conviction that effective education required more than just the transmission of knowledge. Tom and Lisa's partnership, in particular, had evolved into what sociologists might term collaborative cognitive enhancement. Their different approaches to problem solving, Tom's intuitive leaps balanced by Lisa's systematic analysis, demonstrated how diverse cognitive styles could complement and enhance each other. "Miss Sarah," Lisa called out, her voice carrying the excitement of discovery, "I think I understand why multiplication is like a special kind of counting. It's like taking bigger steps instead of little ones." The observation, though expressed in elementary terms, touched on fundamental principles of mathematical progression that had occupied theorists for centuries. The Science Bulletin Board, with its carefully curated display of student work, served as what curriculum theorists might term a cross-disciplinary nexus, a space where mathematical concepts could be observed in their practical applications. Miss Sarah had deliberately positioned mathematical problems alongside scientific observations, creating what she called cognitive bridges between different areas of study. As the morning light reached its zenith, casting minimal shadows across the blue desks, Miss Sarah recognized that she was witnessing more than just a mathematics lesson. She was observing the delicate intersection of cognitive development, social interaction, and educational theory, all playing out in the simple acts of children learning to multiply numbers. The classroom, with its carefully curated elements, from the cursive alphabet above to the fraction cards hanging like mathematical mobiles, had become more than just a physical space. It was a carefully orchestrated environment where learning could unfold naturally, where understanding could develop at its own pace, and where each student could discover their own path to mathematical comprehension. This realization represented the culmination of years of professional growth and pedagogical refinement. Miss Sarah had learned, through careful observation and thoughtful adaptation, that effective teaching required a delicate balance between structure and flexibility, between guidance and discovery. The theoretical frameworks she had studied had been transformed by practical experience into something more organic, more responsive to the natural rhythms of learning and development. As she watched her students work, their faces reflecting varying degrees of concentration and comprehension, she understood that she was participating in something far more significant than simple mathematics instruction. She was witnessing and facilitating the complex process of cognitive development, a process as intricate and beautiful as the mathematical patterns her students were learning to recognize and understand. The morning's lesson, ostensibly focused on multiplication tables, had become a manifestation of what educational philosophers termed holistic learning theory, the idea that true understanding emerged not from isolated facts but from the complex interplay of experience, interaction, and reflection. Each student, in their own way, was participating in this intricate dance of development. As the lesson drew to a close, Miss Sarah reflected on how her understanding of education had evolved, much like the mathematical patterns her students were discovering. What had begun as a simple desire to teach had transformed into a profound appreciation for the complexity of human learning and development. The classroom, with its yellow walls and morning light, its fraction cards and cursive letters, had become not just a space for learning but a testament to the endless possibilities of human understanding. Tom's final observation of the morning captured this truth with unexpected clarity. Numbers are like friends, aren't they, Miss Sarah? The more you get to know them, the more interesting they become. In that simple statement lay the essence of what philosophers, theorists, and educators had been attempting to articulate for centuries, that learning, at its core, was a process of building relationships, not just with knowledge, but with understanding itself.